Imagine you are standing in the middle of a desert. The sun is brutal. The soil beneath your feet is cracked and pale, like the surface of the moon. Nothing grows here. Nothing survives here. Farmers gave up on this land years ago. Scientists wrote it off. Development agencies passed it by. And then you see it. A tree. Tall, graceful, almost impossibly green. Its feathery leaves flutter in the dry wind like tiny green flags. It is not struggling. It is not barely surviving. It is thriving. Right here in soil that would kill almost anything else on earth. You walk closer. You reach out and touch its bark. And if this tree could talk, it would tell you a story so extraordinary, so quietly world-changing, that you might have to sit down for a moment just to take it all in. This tree is called moringa, and what it can do will rearrange everything you thought you knew about hunger, energy, and clean water. Let's go back 4,000 years, northern India. Around 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, the monsoons have failed. Again. Wells are running dry, the rivers are low and muddy, children are hungry, the elderly are weakening, and a community of people, without laboratories, without universities, without Google, has discovered something remarkable. They have a tree they call shigru, the miracle tree. They eat its leaves, which taste something like spinach, only richer, more filling. They cook its long, slender pods the way we might cook green beans or snap peas. They press oil from its seeds, a clean golden oil that burns in their lamps all through the night and never goes rancid, never spoils. But here is the moment that changes everything. The water has turned brown, contaminated, dangerous. People are getting sick. And one of them, some quiet, observant, brilliant human being whose name history never recorded, does something unexpected. They crush some moringa seeds into a powder and stir it into a clay pot of dirty water. They wait. 30 minutes pass. They look into the pot. The water is clear, not somewhat clearer, not a little better, clear. The dirt has sunk to the bottom. The bacteria are gone. The water is safe to drink. No chemicals, no filters, no engineering. Just a seed, just a tree that decided to grow in hard soil and give everything it had to the people around it. Word travels the way remarkable things always do. Slowly, generation by generation, moringa moves across the ancient world. Ayurvedic physicians in India, the founders of one of humanity's oldest medical traditions, document it treating hundreds of conditions, not with mystery or magic, but with pure, concentrated nutrition that the human body desperately needs. By 600 years before the modern era, the Romans are importing moringa oil from Egypt and India. They pay premium prices for it. Arab traders carry it along the Silk Road, that ancient highway of ideas and goods that connected East and West for centuries. It spreads across the dry regions of Africa. The Sahel, that vast band of semi-desert where almost nothing else can grow, and becomes a quiet, steady lifeline for millions of people. For 4,000 years, this tree does not ask for anything. No fertilizer, no pesticides, no irrigation systems, no machinery, no imported chemicals. You plant it once and it feeds you for 20 years. Think about that. 20 years, one planting, 2 decades of leaves, pods, seeds, and oil. On land that nothing else will grow on. Then comes the 1800s, and for the first time, the scientific world turns its instruments toward moringa and tries to measure what people have known in their bones for 40 centuries. British colonial botanists begin documenting every part of the tree. The roots taste like horseradish. The flowers are edible and go beautifully in salads. The young pods are tender and delicious in curries. The mature seeds produce oil. Even the leftover paste from pressing the seeds, what they call seed cake, can feed livestock. And then in 1892, chemists do something that should have made headlines around the world. They measure the leaves. What they find is almost hard to believe. Gram for gram, moringa leaves contain 7 times more vitamin C than oranges, 4 times more calcium than milk, 4 times more vitamin A than carrots, 3 times more potassium than bananas, 2 times more protein than yogurt. Read that again slowly. This is not a vegetable. This is not a herb. This is a full, complete, almost miraculous source of human nutrition. And it grows on a tree that thrives in drought, in poor soil, in places where the people who need it most already live. The scientists write their papers. They send their reports. The data is clear, documented, and extraordinary. And somewhere in the background, a very different kind of man is watching the world and calculating something far less generous than a scientific discovery. His name is John D. Rockefeller. And what happens next will shape the next century of human history in ways that are still rippling through our lives today. To understand what happened to Moringa, you first have to understand the man who changed everything. Not because he was uniquely evil, not because he was some cartoon villain twirling a mustache in a dark room, but because he was something arguably more dangerous than that. He was a genius, a ruthless, methodical, breathtakingly effective genius. And he looked at the world not as it was, but as a system to be controlled. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in rural New York. His father was a traveling con man who sold fake cancer cures from a wagon. His mother was deeply religious and disciplined. From his father, young John learned the mechanics of a deal. From his mother, he learned the value of patience and long-term thinking. Together, those two lessons would make him the most powerful private individual in the history of the modern world. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil in Cleveland, Ohio. He was 31 years old. What followed was not simply a business success story. It was a systematic, calculated campaign to make one thing, petroleum, the only option available to the entire world. By 1880, just 10 years after founding his company, Rockefeller controlled 90% of all oil refining in America. Not 50%, not 70, 90. Nearly the entire industry in the hands of one man. But here is what most people miss about how he did it. It was not just competition, it was architecture. Rockefeller did not simply outcompete his rivals. He built a system that made petroleum inevitable. Pipelines snaking across Pennsylvania, refineries in New Jersey, distribution networks stretched across 30 states. Gasoline stations appearing on every corner of every town like mushrooms after rain. And then he did something particularly devastating to his competitors. He sold kerosene, his main product at the time, below cost, cheaper than it cost him to make it. Other companies, unable to match his prices, went bankrupt. Once they collapsed, once the competition was gone, he raised prices again. It was a slow, patient, almost surgical elimination of every alternative. By 1900, Standard Oil was the largest corporation in the world, and Rockefeller became the first person in history to accumulate $1 billion of personal wealth. But then two things happened that threatened everything he had built. First, electric lights began replacing kerosene lamps. The product that had made him rich was becoming obsolete. Homes across America were being wired for electricity, and suddenly, people did not need kerosene to light their evenings anymore. His empire needed a new product desperately. Second, and far more dangerous to his interests, the automobile arrived, and with it, a question that would define the entire 20th century. What should cars run on? This sounds like a simple engineering question. It was not. It was a political and economic earthquake waiting to happen. Because in 1900, the answer was genuinely, honestly open. Multiple fuels existed. Multiple futures were possible. And the wrong answer, wrong for Rockefeller that is, could have changed everything. Here is what almost nobody knows. When Rudolf Diesel demonstrated his revolutionary new engine at the Paris World Exhibition in 1900, he did not use petroleum. He used peanut oil, a vegetable oil, pressed from plants. Diesel himself wrote in his journal that vegetable oils for engine fuel may seem insignificant at the time, but could become as important as petroleum itself. He believed, genuinely, passionately believed, that farmers would one day grow their own fuel. That energy would be local, distributed, and free from the control of any single corporation or government. Moringa oil works in a diesel engine. So does cottonseed oil, sunflower oil, hemp oil. Dozens of plant-based oils that could be grown, pressed, and used locally without pipelines, without refineries, without a single penny going to Standard Oil. And Henry Ford, yes, that Henry Ford, launched the Model T in 1908 as a flex fuel vehicle. It was designed to run on gasoline or ethanol, which could be fermented from corn, hemp, or any number of common plants. Ford told reporters that there was fuel in every bit of vegetable matter that could be fermented. He imagined American farmers growing their own fuel. He imagined energy independence at the level of the individual family and the individual farm. Two futures stood at the crossroads. One was petroleum, centralized, controlled, flowing through systems owned by a handful of powerful men. The other was plants, distributed, local, impossible to monopolize, growing in the soil of a million farms and villages. One man decided for everyone, and he did not pick the plants. By 1920, ethanol was still available at filling stations across America. Farmers were distilling it from corn. It was real, it was working, it was a genuine competitor to gasoline. By 1925, it was essentially gone. Not because it stopped working, not because a better technology replaced it. It disappeared because the oil industry poured money into lobbying efforts that reshaped the laws of the country. States passed legislation restricting ethanol sales. The infrastructure locked in. Every new car was designed for gasoline. Every pump sold only petroleum products. The engineering schools stopped teaching students how to work with vegetable oil engines. The knowledge quietly faded from the curriculum, the way a language disappears when the last speakers stop teaching it to their children. And then, in 1913, Rudolf Diesel, the man who had demonstrated that engines could run on plant oil, the man whose name became synonymous with a technology that never had to depend on petroleum, fell off a ship crossing the English Channel on his way to a meeting in London. His body was found 10 days later. The official verdict was suicide. Whether it was or not, history does not tell us with certainty. What history does tell us is that his vision died with him, and that is a fact worth sitting with quietly for a moment. By 1930, petroleum was not simply the dominant fuel, it was the only fuel. Not because nature made it so, not because the market freely chose it, but because a system had been deliberately, carefully, patiently constructed to make every other option invisible. And somewhere out in the fields, in the dry soil of India and Africa and Latin America, moringa trees kept growing, patient, silent, waiting. They did not know they had been erased from the future. They just kept growing. Here is something that sounds like a paradox but is not. It is entirely possible to feed the world and keep it hungry at the same time. It depends on what you mean by feeding. If feeding means moving calories from one place to another, growing grain in one country and shipping it to another, building supply chains that stretch across oceans, creating systems so complex and so expensive that entire nations must go into debt just to participate in them, then yes, the world has been fed, technically, on paper. But if feeding means something deeper, something more human, if it means a family growing what they need in their own soil, on their own land, with their own hands and never having to beg or borrow or buy their way to the next meal, then the world has not been fed at all. Millions of people have been made to look fed while the roots of their independence were quietly pulled up beneath them. This is the story of the Green Revolution, and moringa is the shadow it cast. The year is 1943. The place is Mexico. And on the surface, what is happening looks like one of the most generous acts in the history of international development. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913 with an initial endowment worth more than $5 billion in today's money, launches the Mexican Agricultural Program. The stated mission is simple and beautiful. End hunger, increase crop yields, feed the poor. The director is a scientist named Norman Borlaug. He is brilliant, dedicated, and genuinely wants to help people. He develops new varieties of wheat that grow faster and produce more grain per acre than anything seen before. Yields rise dramatically. More food is grown. On the surface, it looks like a miracle. And in some ways, it genuinely was. Real people ate who might not have eaten. Real children survived who might not have survived. That truth deserves to be acknowledged honestly and fully. But here is the other truth, the one that hides behind the miracle. These new high-yield seeds come with conditions attached. They are not like the ancient seeds that farmers had saved and replanted for generations. They cannot simply be dropped into ordinary soil and left to grow. They require synthetic fertilizers to reach their potential. They require petroleum-based pesticides to survive the insects and diseases that the old, hardier varieties resisted naturally. They require diesel-powered irrigation systems to get enough water. They require machinery and fuel for that machinery and supply chains to deliver that fuel and money to pay for all of it. In other words, they require petroleum at every single step. And who controlled petroleum? Whose foundations were funding the research? Whose family's fortune had been built on creating systems of dependency that extracted wealth from the many and concentrated it in the hands of the few? The answer does not require a conspiracy. It only requires understanding how systems work. When the people who fund research also profit from the conclusions that research leads to, you do not need secret meetings in dark rooms. The outcome shapes itself. Between 1960 and 1990, the Green Revolution spreads outward from Mexico like rings in a pond. India, Pakistan, the Philippines, across Africa. Governments, often under enormous pressure from international institutions, with foreign aid tied explicitly to adopting industrial farming methods, dismantle the agricultural systems their people had maintained for centuries. Traditional farming in these regions was not primitive. That word, primitive, is one of the most damaging words in the history of development because it was used to describe systems that were actually extraordinarily sophisticated. They had been refined over thousands of years. They were adapted to local soils, local climates, local needs. They used trees like moringa not as decorations, but as essential components of a living, breathing agricultural ecosystem. Moringa fixes nitrogen in the soil. That means it takes nitrogen from the air, the same nitrogen that synthetic fertilizers are made from, at enormous expense and with enormous petroleum consumption, and deposits it directly into the earth for free, naturally, continuously. Farmers who grew moringa alongside their crops did not need to buy fertilizer. The tree was the fertilizer. Moringa provided shade that reduced water evaporation, meaning crops nearby needed less irrigation. Its deep roots broke up compacted soil and allowed rainwater to penetrate rather than run off. Its leaves, when they fell, decomposed into rich organic matter that fed the soil microbes that kept the whole system alive. This was not one tree doing one job. This was one tree doing 15 jobs simultaneously for free for 20 years. And it was called backward. Millions of acres of these living, breathing, self-sustaining food systems were cleared, bulldozed, replaced with flat, monocultural fields of hybrid wheat and rice that needed constant inputs to survive. Inputs that had to be purchased, that created debt, that tied farmers to global supply chains they had no power over. In India, the government launches Operation Flood in 1970, a program to modernize dairy and agriculture. Foreign aid arrives, but it comes with strings. It is tied to purchasing tractors from specific manufacturers, fertilizers from specific suppliers, pesticides from specific chemical companies. The money flows in and then flows right back out again to the corporations that supplied the inputs. Moringa trees that had stood for decades, feeding families and fixing nitrogen and purifying water, are cleared to make room for hybrid crops that need constant irrigation. The wells are drilled deeper. The diesel pumps run longer. The debt grows. Across Africa, International Monetary Fund loans arrive with conditions attached. Adopt industrial agriculture, grow export crops, open your markets. Countries that had fed themselves for thousands of years begin importing food. Countries that had no foreign debt accumulate crushing loans. And the crops they are encouraged to grow, cotton, coffee, cocoa, are not even food. They are products for wealthy foreign consumers. The farmers growing them cannot eat them. By 1980, the design is complete. Nations that were food sovereign, that fed their own people from their own land using their own knowledge, are now dependent on international markets for both food and fuel. They buy grain with dollars borrowed from international banks. They buy diesel with those same borrowed dollars. When oil prices rise, they cannot afford to farm. When grain prices rise, their people go hungry. This was presented as modernization. It was, in fact, the most sophisticated poverty trap ever constructed. And all the while, the science on moringa kept accumulating quietly in the background. In 1992, a researcher named Monica Booth publishes a study confirming what people in India had known for 4,000 years. Moringa seeds purify contaminated water. The proteins in the seeds bind to bacteria, E. coli, salmonella, cholera, causing them to clump together and sink to the bottom of the container. The reduction in bacterial contamination is between 90 and 99%. Not somewhat cleaner water, not marginally safer water. Water reduced to near drinking quality by stirring in a powder made from a seed that grows on a tree that costs nothing to plant and nothing to maintain. In 2007, the World Health Organization documents moringa use in rural communities across 14 countries. One tree, they note, produces enough seeds to purify water for an entire family for one full year. In 2011, a comprehensive review published in a respected scientific journal analyzes 17 separate studies on moringa nutrition. The data is consistent and overwhelming. 100 grams of dried moringa leaves contain 25 grams of protein, 2,300 milligrams of calcium, 28 milligrams of iron, 19 grams of fiber, more iron than beef, more calcium than milk, more vitamin A than carrots. The United States Department of Agriculture publishes the nutritional data. Universities around the world study it. The science is documented, peer-reviewed, and freely available to anyone who looks for it. And the international development agencies, the institutions funded and shaped by the same foundations that had systematically dismantled traditional agriculture, continue to ignore it. Because moringa offers something that no corporation can sell. It offers a solution you do not have to buy. And in a world built on manufactured dependency, a free solution is the most dangerous thing imaginable. There is a particular kind of resilience that belongs only to living things. A corporation can be dissolved. A law can be repealed. A pipeline can be decommissioned. A refinery shut down. A patent allowed to expire. Human institutions, no matter how powerful, no matter how deeply embedded in the fabric of civilization, are ultimately fragile. They depend on money, on political will, on the continued cooperation of people who can always, at any moment, choose differently. But a tree does not need your cooperation. A tree does not need funding or legislation or a favorable market environment. A tree needs soil, sunlight, and water. And moringa, as we have seen, does not even need much of that. You cannot bankrupt a tree. You cannot lobby against a seed. You cannot pass a law that stops a root from growing. And so, while Rockefeller's foundations reshaped universities, while international institutions dismantled traditional agriculture, while development agencies redrew the farming practices of entire continents, moringa kept growing, quietly, stubbornly, in the margins and the ditches and the forgotten corners of the world where the machinery of control never quite reached. This is the part of the story that does not make you angry. This is the part that makes you breathe again. Picture a village in the highlands of Kenya. No paved roads, no electricity grid, no supply chain delivering fertilizer bags from a factory in another country. A group of women, mothers, grandmothers, daughters, have formed a small cooperative. They meet in the mornings when the air is still cool and the light is soft and golden across the hills. They have moringa trees, rows of them, tall and feathery, growing on land that their neighbors said was useless. And every week they harvest. Leaves for their families to eat, pods for cooking, seeds pressed carefully into clean, golden oil. Oil they use in their kitchens, oil they sell at the local market, oil that never requires a truck from a refinery or a price set by people in suits in cities they will never visit. They do not call it a revolution. They do not write papers about it. They simply do what the women of their grandmother's generation did, and their great-grandmothers before that, And 40 generations before that, stretching back through the centuries to the first person who noticed that this remarkable tree could sustain an entire community on its own. In Haiti, after hurricanes strip the land bare and leave nothing standing, villagers plant moringa. It is one of the first things they reach for in the rubble of a disaster because they know what their grandparents knew. This tree comes back. It grows fast, 15 feet in a single year. And once it is established, almost nothing can kill it. It survives drought. It survives poor soil. It survives neglect. Plant it and walk away, and it will still be there, still producing, still feeding, still giving. In the Philippines, small farming communities that never fully adopted industrial agriculture maintain their moringa trees alongside their rice paddies. The trees fix nitrogen in the soil, reducing the need for fertilizers they cannot afford anyway. The leaves go into soups and stews that give children the vitamins and minerals that keep them healthy through the long dry seasons when other vegetables are scarce and expensive. In Nicaragua, rural health workers teach young mothers how to make moringa leaf powder, dried, ground fine, stirred into food, to treat children showing signs of malnutrition. The results are not dramatic in the way that pharmaceutical interventions are dramatic, with their clinical trials and press releases and carefully managed rollouts. They are quiet and human and real. A child who was thin and listless begins to brighten. Eyes that were dull become alert. A mother who was frightened becomes steady. No patent, no profit margin, no supply chain, just a leaf and a mother and a child, connected by 4,000 years of knowledge that refuse to be erased. And then sometime around the turn of the 21st century, something unexpected happened. The wellness industry found moringa. It began as these things often do, with a trickle. A few health bloggers writing about superfoods, a handful of nutritionists mentioning it in articles, a small number of specialty stores stocking it in capsule form, and then the trickle became a stream, and the stream became a flood, and suddenly moringa powder was sitting on the shelves of upscale grocery stores in London and New York and Sydney, packaged in elegant matte bags with minimalist typography, selling for $25 a pound. The same leaves that grow freely on roadsides across India and Kenya and Haiti, harvested by hand and dried in the sun at essentially zero cost, were now being sold to health-conscious consumers in wealthy countries as the latest nutritional discovery. On one hand, this is genuinely good news. More people learning about moringa means more pressure on institutions to take it seriously. More demand means more trees being planted. More awareness means the knowledge spreads further and becomes harder to suppress. But look carefully at what the wellness industry chose to promote, and look equally carefully at what it chose to leave out. The supplement companies talk about the nutrition. They talk about the protein content, the vitamin profile, the antioxidants. They put the word superfood on the packaging in large, reassuring letters. They sell moringa as a personal health product, something you add to your morning smoothie to feel better about yourself. What they do not mention is the fuel. What they do not mention is the water purification. What they do not mention is that this tree, planted in sufficient numbers across the regions that need it most, could provide energy independence to villages that currently spend money they do not have on diesel imported from halfway around the world. Because here is the uncomfortable arithmetic that the supplement industry would prefer you not think about. If moringa solves the fuel crisis for rural communities in the developing world, there is no product to sell. If a village plants 100 moringa trees and presses their own oil to run their own generator, they have not purchased anything from anyone. They have simply grown their way to energy independence. That is not a market. That is the absence of a market. And the wellness industry, whatever its genuine enthusiasm for moringa's nutritional benefits, is still an industry. It still needs things to sell. The global moringa market is projected to reach $5.6 billion by 2028. That is a staggering number, and virtually all of it represents moringa being sold as a supplement to people in wealthy countries who do not need it in the way that a malnourished child in a drought-stricken region needs it. The people who need moringa most are not the market. The people who can afford to pay $25 for a bag of powder are the market. Meanwhile, the communities sitting beneath moringa trees right now, Communities that have access to the most nutritionally complete, energetically versatile, water-purifying organism on the planet are still being offered petroleum-dependent development solutions by international agencies. Still being encouraged to take loans tied to industrial agricultural inputs. Still being told that the ancient, self-sufficient systems their grandparents used were backward and unscientific. Still being sold scarcity in the middle of abundance. But here is what a century of suppression and a decade of commercialization have both failed to account for. You cannot own a moringa tree. You cannot patent a seed that has been growing wild across 46 countries for 4,000 years. You cannot trademark the knowledge of how to press oil from a moringa seed. That knowledge lives in the hands of grandmothers in villages that no corporation has ever visited and no foundation has ever funded. The tree is still here, the knowledge is still here, and something is changing. In university agriculture departments across India, researchers are publishing detailed studies on moringa cultivation as a sustainable energy crop. In Kenya, NGOs are training farmers to press moringa oil as a diesel substitute for small generators. In the Philippines, government health programs are beginning, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, to incorporate moringa into nutrition initiatives for children. In Haiti, reforestation projects are using moringa as a pioneer species, the first tree planted on damaged land, because it grows so fast and gives so much back to the soil around it. The word is spreading, not through the channels that Rockefeller's foundations built, not through the institutions that shaped the last century of development, but through the older, slower, more durable channels. Person to person, farmer to farmer, mother to daughter, community to community. The way knowledge has always truly survived. 3 crises define our moment in history. 3 problems that governments spend trillions of dollars attempting to solve, with solutions that require more spending, more infrastructure, more dependency on systems controlled by fewer and fewer people. Energy, food, water, and growing on marginal land across the tropics, requiring nothing, asking nothing, giving everything. A tree addresses all 3, for free, forever, without a single patent, a single pipeline, a single international loan with conditions attached. One mature moringa tree produces between 3 and 5 liters of oil every year from its seeds. Plant 100 trees in a village, and you have enough oil to run a small generator, enough to provide light, enough to power a water pump, enough to refrigerate medicine, enough to charge the phones that connect isolated communities to the rest of the world. No drilling, no refinery, no OPEC, no price shock rippling through a global market. Just trees growing in the ground, doing what they have always done. The same tree produces fresh leaves every single week in tropical climates, year-round, without killing the plant. Enough to provide complete nutrition, real, dense, extraordinary nutrition to multiple families. Vitamin A that prevents children from going blind. Iron that prevents anemia in pregnant women. Calcium that builds bones in growing bodies. Protein that sustains muscle and keeps minds sharp. This is food security that costs nothing after planting. Nothing. Not a dollar, not a loan, not a supply chain stretching back to an agricultural corporation in another hemisphere. And from those same seeds, after the oil is pressed, a simple powder remains. Stir it into contaminated water. Wait 30 minutes. The bacteria clump and sink. The water clears. One tree produces enough seeds to purify water for dozens of families every year. No filtration plant, no chlorination system, no infrastructure budget, no debt. One tree, fuel, food, medicine, clean water. The miracle was never lost. It was only waiting.